And I hear the noon whistle in Fort Atkinson. So that is the signal, Sandra and everyone else, that we kick this webinar off. So this is Steve Larson with Horge Dairyman staff up here in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, welcoming you to our monthly webinar series. Always glad to have a nice crowd of folks out there. It gives us a chance to say hi to our presenter Sandra and our co-host Mike Hutchins down at the University of Illinois, and also thank Jim Baltz, his sidekick down there, who does technical duties for us, and also Patty Urchin up here in the Horge Dairyman office, who does a lot of the logistics and mechanics here locally. So we are very interested in our topic today, kind of an interesting development that's taken place in the dairy industry in the recent years, handling calves in groups. It's a change in mindset for a lot of us. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what Sandra has to share with us today. So with that, Mike Hutchins, would you introduce our presenter, and we're off and running.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. And it's really a professional and personal pleasure to introduce Sandra Godden, our professor from the University of Minnesota in the Veterinary College here today. Sandra graduated from the Ontario Veterinary College, located over there at the University of Guelph, and then practiced for a couple of years in Eastern Ontario, and then went back and got her doctors of veterinary medicine at Guelph as well. And then from 1998 till currently, she is a member of the Department of Population Medicine at the University of Minnesota, and she conducts teaching, applied research, and outreach activities as well. She has just got a boatload of awards and recognitions here that recognizes her skills, both from students and from colleagues and co-workers as well. So with that very brief introduction, Sandra, we're very pleased to have you on our June Horge Dairyman webinar, and we'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I want to thank you and Steve for the invitation. It's a very nice day to be here. I'm looking forward to visiting with you about this topic. So as you mentioned, Mike, the topic is feeding calves in group house systems. We've got the title Feeding Calves as Groupies, Pros, Cons, and Best Management Practices. And you mentioned this was a relatively new thing. It's actually not a relatively new thing. It's something that we're recycling. It's an idea that came and went 30 years ago, 25 years ago, and as with many things, we forget about stuff and then we rediscover things. And so in the last 5 or 10 years, we've rediscovered group housing, and with the introduction of new technologies, computer feeders, this has become of interest to some of our dairy producers. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. As all of you know, dairy producers, that there are several different areas that you need to focus on in your calf program, from newborn care to colostrum, disease control, and there's a lot of different things on this list. But what we're going to be talking about today is the intersection between housing systems and the nutrition program, because really it's an interaction or an intersection between these two items that are very important to the calf, but that's what we're going to be talking about with respect to the group housing and computer feeding systems. To me, this is somewhat of a chicken and egg question. What comes first, the decision on what feeding system a producer wants to adopt, or their decision on what housing system they want to use? And I think it could go either direction, but sometimes a decision gets made on a milk delivery system that might influence the choice of housing, or vice versa. A producer might choose their preferred housing system, and then that may dictate what type of feeding or milk delivery system. It could go either way. But because these two things interact so closely, I thought I'd spend a couple of minutes just reviewing the goals and principles of the nutrition program first, just so that we're all on the same page there. And then from nutrition, we're going to leap into the housing and talk about goals and principles of housing. And very quickly, we'll talk about the basics of other conventional housing systems very quickly, but then I want to get into the group housing programs and specifically computer feeding systems. Talk about pros and cons, what have we learned, at least thus far, because we are all still learning how to manage these systems, and then at least what are our current recommendations for managing these systems if this is something that you choose to adopt. All right, so we're going to start with nutrition, and with nutrition here, what I'm really talking about is the milk program, the milk feeding program for that pre-weaned calves. We know that the plane of nutrition coming from milk is very, very important to both the calf and to the future performance of the adult animal. In the short term, how much milk, protein, energy it is coming from milk is going to dictate growth, average daily gain in that baby calf. It's going to influence its ability to deal with cold stress, which in Minnesota and most of our upper states is at least 5 or 6 months of the year, if not more, that calves are cold stressed. And finally, the level of protein, energy, vitamins, and minerals coming from milk are going to affect its immune system and its ability to deal with disease if it's challenged with some pathogen out of its environment. So in the short term, plane of milk nutrition affects growth, ability to deal with cold stress, and health. In the long term, how we feed this baby calf will affect a lot of things that influence its future lifetime productivity for you and economics for you. It can impact on age at first calving, and evidence is mounting that first lactation milk production and maybe second lactation milk production is enhanced if we have a higher plane of nutrition in that neonate. So with more milk, the cow sticks around longer, improved longevity, improved lifetime economics. So there are both short and long-term benefits to making sure we do things right with this baby calf. And so currently what our goal is, and this is from Mike Van Amberg from Cornell, our goal is to double the birth weight of that calf by the time we wean it. So assuming we're weaning at 8 weeks of age, 56 days, just with this little example here, if we had a 40-kilo calf at birth, we want that calf weighing 80 kilos at weaning. If we do the math, that means that we need to achieve an average daily gain of roughly 0.7 kilos per day, or converted to pounds, it's 1.6 to 1.7 pounds per day of average daily gain. And I know some of you out there are easily achieving this. Some of you are well exceeding this goal, this target for rate of gain. But if we can get there, 1.6 pounds per day, then we'll be well on our way to capturing the benefits that we're seeing over here in the short and the long-term performance of that animal. So then the question becomes, all right, if this is our goal, double the birth weight by weaning, then what are our options for the milk feeding program in order to achieve that goal? Now, if we think about how we've done things traditionally, the old program has been to feed 1 gallon of milk or milk replacer a day. That's roughly 10% of the body weight of the calf of either whole milk or a conventional milk replacer formula like a 20-20 or 22-20. So a gallon a day or 1 to 1.25 pounds of powder a day. If we stay on this type of program, we are going to come nowhere near achieving that goal of doubling the birth weight of the calf. We just won't get there. Best in warm weather, we might get 0.5 pound of average daily gain. In cold weather, we might get 0 weight gain, and in fact weight loss and cold stress starvation syndrome. So our old conventional way of rearing calves isn't going to get us there. So what we need to be doing is thinking about a different line of thinking for feeding calves their milk. A new program, how we will get there, is by feeding roughly 20% of the birth weight of the calf, or if you think of it in gallons, it's 2 gallons a day or even more, of one of two types of liquid milk programs that could either be an accelerated milk replacer formula. So I'm trying to get my cursor to work here. Accelerated simply means that the concentration of, typically it's the protein concentration in these formulas, is bumped up to something similar to what mom would have done. So in this example, I've got an accelerated milk replacer formula balanced at 28% crude protein, 20 fat. So the concentration of protein is greater, and we're going to feed more of it. Rather than 1 pound of powder a day, we're going to feed 2 to 2.5 pounds of powder a day of this program. The alternative is to feed whole milk from mom. That would be 26 to 29, crude protein to crude fat, and again, feeding at a higher rate of 2 to 2.5 gallons a day. If we adopt either of these latter two programs, feeding 20% of the birth weight of the calf or more, we should be able to easily achieve that goal of doubling the birth weight of the calf, or even beyond that. It's not hard to do. The calves are geared to grow at even faster rates if we allow them the nutrition, allow them to express that performance potential. So this is how we're going to get there, is by feeding more milk, basically. All right, so this takes us to our first polling question, because I just wanted to get a sense of our audience out there, what are you guys doing today?
Okay, well, we're ready to vote here. Steve, you're going to have to vote, but you're going to vote for jerseys, aren't you?
Yeah, right. And I can see where our jersey deal is, but I don't know.
Can I interrupt on the jersey thing? We work with a dairy here in central Minnesota that's feeding 2 gallons a day to Jersey calves, and they're reaching that by a week to 10 days of age.
Wow.
My goodness. Well, that's really impressive. I think we'd probably be more in the 6-quart area for our calves, but
okay. Well, we're slow voting here today, Steve. What is the problem here?
I don't know.
Maybe there's too many Republicans in the primary. That's all I can figure out. They're up to 9 or 10.
It is getting sort of watered out a little bit there. Kind of thinned out,
let's.
We're close to 2/3 now. So
yeah, let's close it off, and Sandra, we'll let you make your comments to see what we're finding here in terms of numbers. Any surprises for you?
Sure. Actually, I'm pleasantly surprised that the majority of people report they're feeding at least 6 quarts a day, and a good proportion of people are feeding 8 quarts a day or more, and that is exactly the kind of thing that we would like to see if we're shooting for that goal of doubling the birth weight by weaning. There are a few people that are still hanging on to the traditional program of something in the neighborhood of 4 quarts per day, and to those people, I guess the question is that a seasonal thing? Hopefully you adjust that for wintertime feeding if you are in a cold part of the world. But also I would suggest that those people examine their goals for their calf feeding program, and what are their goals for average daily gain, what are their goals for future performance. And really it's a question of figuring out what are your goals, and once you've established your goals, working backwards to develop the program that's going to allow you to achieve those goals. Now, one of the areas that people will push back on, we can close that poll, when they're encouraged to feed more milk, like 8 quarts a day, one of the questions that producers will have at times is, well, that's going to cost me money. Obviously, I'm putting at least double, if not more, of the investment into milk or a milk replacer if I'm going to feed 8 quarts per day versus 4 quarts a day. When will I get paid back? So there are several places that you get paid back for that additional investment in more milk in that baby calf. In the short term, I've already mentioned improved health, fewer treatments and labor involved with that, and hopefully lower mortality rate in the pre-weaning period. In the long term, we can see benefits like reduced age at first calving, and even more interesting is we have several studies now that I'm showing up on this screen right now that report a significant bump in first lactation milk production if we can enhance the average daily gain in that pre-weaned calf through feeding an accelerated type program. So the slide that we've got on the screen here right now is showing the results of a meta-analysis that was conducted by the group at Cornell University. They looked at 10 different studies. Each of these studies are randomized clinical trials where the control group was a group of calves fed a traditional, conventional 1 gallon of milk a day of a 20/20. As compared to the treatment group, the treatment was an accelerated type program. So we're looking at a 26/20, a 28/20, fed at roughly 2 gallons of milk a day. And so for each one of these studies, the level of milk intake was increased by at least 75% in the treated group over the control group. So in the left-hand column, you've just got the study that was analyzed, and then the bottom is the meta-analysis effect. And the meta-analysis is simply a summary, an averaging, if you will, of the overall effect when they examine the effect within all of these different studies. In the middle column, you see the difference in milk production in the accelerated group, and you can see in every single study except this one study there was a numeric bump in milk production in first lactation if you're in the accelerated group. And overall, on average, there was a 429 kilos of more milk produced in the accelerated groups. The the last column over here is just the p-value indicating the significance of the study. All studies are showing a trend, statistical trend, or statistical significance, except that one study that didn't see a difference. So overall, you should be getting paid back in the short term with a healthier calf, in the long term with reduced age at first calving and or improved milk production. And the Cornell group is now starting to generate some data showing advances in or enhanced second lactation production as well. So to those people who are still kind of a little bit reluctant to make the transition to feeding more milk, this is hopefully some data to encourage you, to convince you that you will get paid back. All right, so just to summarize the nutrition summary, and then we're going to move into housing. Though not all data agree 100%, the vast majority of studies conclude that early life nutrient intake through milk does have short impacts on health and growth, long-term impacts on productivity, and therefore economics. So it's something we all want to think about. All right, so from that, we want to think about, okay, how are we going to deliver this milk to the calves? And so we're going to segue into the housing system. So that leads us to our second polling question here, and I'm just asking this question because, again, I just want to get a sense of what our audience members are doing out there.
Well, very good, Sandra. Polls are now open. You have 4 choices. Individual hutches, first choice. Second choice, individual pens in a barn. Very popular. Number 3, group housing with a computer feeder. And finally, group housing with manual feed delivery. This could be mob feeding and things like that. So let's see what's going to happen here. We're off and running, a little faster voting here, finally.
Yeah, good voting. That's just a little more clear cut. Yeah, our calves are being raised on option number 4, which is group housing with actually sort of a small stanchion headgate kind of arrangement, fed in buckets that way, 8 calves per pen. So that's where we would fit on this one. But let's see what the others have to say.
Yep, let's close it off, Jim, and share that with Dr. Godden. And any surprises there? What do you think?
No, I don't think there are any huge surprises here. I think like we expected, or like I expected, the vast majority are still using some kind of an individually housed calf program or system. And I guess I don't know where our attendees are calling in from. There are certainly regional differences with types of housing systems we use for calf, but this isn't surprising to me. I was just personally curious as to what was going on out there, so that's why I asked this question. So with that, we're going to continue on with the housing discussion then. So regardless of what type of housing system you are using, I like to back up again to what are the principles or what are the characteristics of a good calf housing system. And for those of you who may be considering a new housing system for your calves, I would encourage you to think about these types of things. So regardless of what the system is, I think to me, this is my little list of best characteristics. First of all, there would be no contact allowed between that baby calf and older animals or the environment of older animals. That would include air, water, bedding, wasted feed, pasture, runoff, lagoons, that kind of thing. We also want to avoid direct contact between baby calves to avoid the risk of transmitting disease from sick calves to healthy calves. Daycare disease is what Dr. Fetra calls this one. The next point is we ideally have an all-in, all-out housing system whereby when the system is emptied, we completely empty it, as with poultry or swine operations, and then we can clean, disinfect, sanitize that system before a new group of animals comes in. Again, that's back to disease control. We want good air quality. We want good bedding management, clean, dry, abundant, and comfortable. Whatever the system we're using, we need to be able to clean and sanitize that system. So if we look over here to the picture of the calf in the individual pen in the barn, everything that comes into contact with that calf needs to be cleanable, if you will. And so when that calf leaves, we need to be able to break that thing down, pressure wash it, sanitize it, including the floor. And we need to be able to clean and sanitize everything that comes into contact with that calf for delivering feed, so buckets, bottles, nipples, etc. The last 2 points I have on my list, again, characteristics of good housing, would be that it allows people to do their jobs without stressing or injuring either the people or the calves. So ease of handling would be another attribute to consider. So this is my little list of best characteristics, and now we're going to talk briefly about, okay, what are the housing systems out there, and how do they or not do they meet or do they not meet this list? And up front, I'll say there is no perfect housing system. They all have advantages, they all have disadvantages. The trick is to figure out what's going to work best in your hands. So if we think about individually housed calves, whether that's in hutches or a calf in a barn in an individual pen here, there are several advantages to these systems. One is that we can easily monitor and control milk intake. We can very quickly spot sick calves if you're feeding the milk 2 or 3 times a day. You're putting out water, you're putting out grain, bedding. You're looking at those calves several times a day, and it's easy to spot a sick calf that doesn't come up and drink its meal or isn't a vigorous drinker. If properly designed, these systems also achieve the goal of not allowing for calf-to-calf contact. Obviously, that will depend on the system. Hutches are good at that. Individual pens in barns are good unless you have open hog panel between calves, in which case, obviously, disease transmission becomes easier. And finally, and this isn't something that we've studied or talked about a lot, but I think this is a real thing, calves that are in these types of systems are socialized early to people because people are coming and feeding them 2 and 3 times a day and working with them on a regular basis. We don't, I think, appreciate that or measure that, but I think that is happening. Now, so those would be some of the advantages. Some of the disadvantages, though, obviously these systems are labor intensive in the sense that 2 or 3 times a day, some systems even 4 times a day, you are hand delivering milk and then grain and water to these calves. And then the other con would be operator comfort. At least in Minnesota at 5 o'clock in the evening in January, it may not be so pleasant out there for that operator delivering milk to those calves. So that's going to vary with the system, the season, and the region. So these would be pros and cons of individually housed calves where you are hand delivering milk. Now, from here forward, we're going to talk about the group housing options and pros and cons of that. So potential benefits, I think some of the things that are attractive to producers. The first is that whether it's ad lib feeding of acidified milk or computer feeding, it becomes perhaps easier, or it facilitates delivering greater quantities of milk to the calf. Not that you can't do that in an individually housed calf, you can. This just becomes easier because you can ask the computer to do it for you. The second point here is that you are reallocating your calf management activities. A lot of producers will think about adopting computer feeding systems thinking they're going to save labor. You won't save labor. What you will do is reallocate labor. So rather than spending however many minutes or hours a day hand delivering milk to calves, you're going to save time there, but you are going to be spending more time doing other things with those calves. So it's perhaps adding some flexibility to when you spend the time with the calves reallocating labor, but you won't save labor. The third point here is that group housing will allow calves the freedom to express natural social behaviors at a younger age, two weeks of age instead of waiting until they're weaned at 8 or 9 weeks of age. We're still researching the significance of that and how important is that. So those would be potential benefits of group housing systems. Now, the potential challenges, these aren't potential, these are challenges. I've got 3 listed here. One is that depending on how we manage them, we can create competition for resources, the most important resources being access to feed and to space. The second concern I have, particularly as a veterinarian, is that now we are breaking that rule. We are allowing direct contact between calves. And so if we introduce a sick calf into this pen, it's going to be very, very easy to transmit disease through nose-to-nose contact, through contamination of that environment, sharing of the nipple, and so forth. So increased disease risk is a real risk when we adopt group housing systems. And then the third point that I've got up here is that it can become more challenging to detect a sick calf when they're hiding in the group. Some producers may think that the computer is going to do this for them, and they actually decrease their time looking at calves. You shouldn't do this. And if you don't have a computer, or even if you are eyeballing calves in the group, it can be hard to find that sick calf that's hiding in the back corner of the pen with a bunch of other calves around it. You're not watching it drink 2 or 3 times a day individually. I'm going to come back and talk about each of these 3 points individually as we work our way through this conversation, but to me these are 3 significant challenges of group housing systems. Now, what would be the milk delivery system for group house calves? There are different options here, and depending on the part of the country you're in, you may or may not be seeing different options being adopted in your neighborhood. On the left here we have acidified milk. This is ad lib feeding, so this has become a little bit of a this is caught on in the Northeast, I guess I'll say, in upper Vermont, New York State, over the last 5 to 10 years in a lot of particularly smaller herds, although some larger herds are working with this. The idea is that you put enough milk out there in that big barrel to last a day or 2, but you have to acidify it, otherwise the bacteria are going to grow at such a rate that tomorrow morning you're going to have a pen full of bloated or dead calves on your hands. So there are some tricks to managing acidified milk feeding systems. We're not going to go into those today. If anybody wants information on them, you can email me and I'll be happy to send you what I've got. The second option in the middle here is mob feeding. This is what my grandfather used to do and what a lot of producers still do today, but we've got a small group of calves here, and 2 or 3 times a day you're going to come up and put fresh or sweet milk out in a trough, or there's different feeding delivery systems for these calves. They're going to suck it back in a couple of minutes and they're going to be done with their meal. Very quickly, advantages, well, I guess you fed 5 calves at once instead of 5 calves individually. I don't know if that saved you a lot of time. The downside here is that the smaller calf is always going to lose. The big calves are always going to win. So you may be restricting milk intake on smaller calves that can't compete. That's all I'm going to say about those 2 feed systems. Now the last one, computer feeders, that's where we're going to spend most of our time, the remaining amount of time for this conversation. So, for computer feeders, here's our little outline. I'm going to review sophisticated versus basic systems and what you get for your buck. What have we learned about managing these systems? What works, what doesn't work? And then at the end of the whole thing, I'll try to bring it all together with just providing a summary of best management practices for group housing and computer feeding systems. So I think everybody's probably familiar with the principle of how a computer feeder or an auto feeder works. The calf has an RFID tag in its ear or a transponder on a collar on its neck. It walks into the computer feeding station. The computer antenna will read the calf, recognize the calf, and it will be pre-programmed to know if it's allowed to dispense another milk meal to that calf. And the producer makes that decision. The producer will decide on how much milk the calf is allowed in a day, how much milk it's allowed per meal, and whether or not there's a set window between meals that the calf has to wait. For example, it must wait for 2 hours between meals before it's allowed its next meal. So if this calf is red, it's allowed its next meal, then the computer will mix up some powder and some water in the little mixer. It will dispense it through a hose through the wall to the nipple to the calf, and life goes on. So there are sophisticated systems. The most common one I think I'm seeing here in the Midwest is manufactured by Forster Technique out of Germany, and it's distributed locally through De La Valve, Gia, and Lely. The left-hand picture here is just a picture of the guts of this machine. There's the mixer, which is just a sophisticated kitchen blender. The hopper above that's dropping powder down into the mixer. Warm water will be pumped in, mixed up, and then dispensed through the hoses through the wall to the calf. So here are the calves on the other side of the wall getting their milk meal. Another sophisticated type system would be Urban out of Germany. We have a few of those systems here in Minnesota and elsewhere. So what do you get for a sophisticated system? Well, they cost about $20,000 to $25,000 per machine. Each machine will dispense usually to 2 nipples, but up to 4 nipples. And so you could feed either 2 pens or 4 pens with one machine, depending on which system you buy. One of the important things to be aware of is that not all machines can simultaneously dispense milk to 2 nipples or to 4 nipples. So what I'm describing here is, let's say you've got 2 nipples, 2 calves in their stations waiting for their meal. some of these machines they can only alternately dispense to one hose or the other, so they're constantly shuttling back and forth, turning off and on between the two pens. To me, this could be a problem if you've got a novice, a brand new baby calf in one of those stalls that doesn't know how to drink, and now it's being refused milk. That may delay its learning curve, if you will, learning how to get onto that system. The other concern that I have is if you have a large group sizes, and now you've got a machine that can only alternately dispense between those two groups, you are significantly cutting into your time budget for the day, and you could run out of time. You could run into a situation where not all calves have enough time to get their milk meal every day, which could be a problem. So if you're out shopping for one of these systems, investigate, ask questions. Is this a system that can or cannot simultaneously dispense to all nipples? Ideally, that would be the case that it could. All right. At least, I won't speak to other parts of the country, but in terms of group size, many of the people who are distributing and selling these systems here in the Midwest are telling producers that they can put 25 and 30 calves on a pen or on a nipple. And I've got a little question here, really. I'm going to show you some data later that suggests that these group sizes are far too large, and you really want to go with something smaller. Next point, for sophisticated systems, you can program the desired meal size and the desired daily allowance. You can ramp them up, you can ramp them down to wean, you can do whatever you like, program whatever feeding program you want for the calf, which is nice. In theory, you could say there's no limit. You could turn it off and let the calves go ad lib. That would be fine too. You can do whatever you want. Now, these systems will have a clean-in-place wash system for the mixer, the dispenser, and the feeding hoses. I'm going to show you some data in a minute to hopefully convince you that these cleaning systems do not work terribly well all the time, and that you really do need to pay close attention to how well they're cleaning. Also be aware that there is no automated cleaning system for those nipples. And finally, the sophisticated systems will download records for calves from individual meals onto a software program on the computer and allow you to monitor things like the daily milk intake, the average daily drinking speed, visits to the feeder, and things like that, which should serve as an aid in monitoring calves and hopefully as an aid in detecting sick calves. Again, I'm going to come back to that in a little bit and suggest that this doesn't always work perfectly either. All right, so that's what you get for a sophisticated system. Now, basic systems, there may be others. The one that I'm aware of is Biotic out of Tennessee. This is far cheaper, $2,500 to $3,000 for a machine. However, the machine only feeds one nipple or one group of calves. Again, it's marketed to say that you could put 25 to 30 calves in a group. I'm going to argue that's too large. These systems, interestingly, they were developed for kids and lambs, so they were actually made to mix and dispense 1 pint of milk at a time, which is a ridiculously small volume for a calf. That obviously won't make a calf happy. So these have been programmed or reprogrammed more recently to continue mixing and dispensing the next pint and the next pint and the next pint, so that hopefully a calf gets a big enough meal to fill it up. But this will have a little bit of an effect of increasing the time it takes to feed a calf, and you could run into the risk of what we're seeing down here is a group of hungry calves crowding around the feeder, jostling to get in because they're hungry. That's what we don't want to see. The hopper on this basic system it only holds 25 pounds of powder, so you will need to be out there frequently refilling it. It will track or record, at least for 2 days, on the machine itself, hanging on the outside of the pan. It will record the calf's milk or daily milk intake records for 2 days. However, it won't dump that data out to a software program that you can easily monitor. So you have to make the effort of going up to the machine and arrowing through every individual calf if you really want to get a sense of what that calf is doing. Finally, these systems don't have an automated cleaning system. It's manual cleaning. Here's a picture of one Biotic mixing bowl. It looks like it's long overdue for cleaning. All right, so that's a quick summary of sophisticated versus basic computer feeder systems. Now, the next thing I would like to do is talk a little bit about what we've learned about managing the computers and the feeders themselves, and then also some things about managing that pen of calves. So the first thing I want to talk about is what we've learned about how well or how consistently these computers will dispense milk, looking at the consistency of the total solids of that mix of powder and water, the sanitation, how well are they cleaning, and the temperature at which the milk is dispensed. So for this question, we're going to go to some data that Bob James from Virginia Tech has produced with a graduate student, Kayla Mikado, a few years ago. They were doing a study of 10 computer feeder dairies in Virginia and North Carolina, and Kayla got to go out and visit these farms on a regular basis. Every day that she went, she collected a milk sample out of the dispenser hose from each machine, and she measured the temperature at which that milk was dispensed, and then it was submitted to a lab where they did bacterial culture for standard plate count, so that's going to reflect how well the machine is cleaning. And finally, she took a Brix reading with a Brix refractometer to estimate the total solids, to look at the level and consistency of the total solids that was being presented to these calves. So what we have here is a table of the results from this particular study. On the left-hand column, we've got farms that were using either basic or sophisticated systems. The next column of variables here describes the SPC, that's the standard plate count, so that's going to reflect bacteria levels or cleaning. The Brix reading, which is going to help us estimate the total solids. And then finally the temperature. And then the N is just the number of milk samples that they were able to capture to analyze for each of these variables. So the first thing we'll look at is the standard plate count. For the basic systems, they average 69, for the sophisticated 13. But I have to draw your attention, this is 69 times 10 to the 5th CFUs per mil, colony forming units of bacteria per mil of milk. So in essence, this is 6.9 million bacteria per milliliter of milk. This is 1.3 million bacteria per milliliter of milk. This is not clean milk. Now, if we go and look at the range, the variation, it goes from 0 to 50 million or 0 to 8.8 million. Some of these machines were dispensing very, very clean milk, obviously. But on average, this was, I'm just going to say it, this was polluted milk. And so on average, these systems were not cleaning as well as they should have been. The next thing we'll look at is the Brix reading, which is going to allow us to estimate the total solids. Total solids in whole milk from a Holstein cow should run in the neighborhood of 12.5% to 13%. In my ideal world, I would like milk replacers to be in a similar range, maybe 13.5%. I don't want them getting too high, or we will run into issues surrounding osmotic diarrhea and digestive problems. So if we look at the average Brix reading for these two types of systems, they're not too bad. They're in the realm of biological plausibility, 10%, 12%, that's safe. But if we look at the variability, this is where I get worried. First of all, we've got at least one reading here with a Brix reading of 7%. Now, if this is reflecting total solids, if total solids is in that neighborhood, these calves are not getting the groceries they need to grow and perform well. So these are going to be unthrifty, poor growing calves. On the other end of the scale, we've got some readings up here around 18%. And this is definitely the zone for creating osmotic diarrhea, Clostridial enteritis, abomasal bloat, abomasal ulcers, and dead calves. Personally, I don't like to see total solids above 15%, and like I mentioned earlier, I would rather say keep it down in the safe range of what the cow would do, and then you've got a margin of error and still be in the safe range. So this variation is a big concern to me. We've got less variation in the sophisticated systems, but again, some low numbers here that would be a concern for the performance of those calves. The last thing we'll look at is the average temperature at which this milk is dispensed. We want that to be body temperature. Somewhere between 95 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit would be fine. And on average, these two types of systems are doing great. But again, let's look at the variation. Here we have one reading of 118 degrees Fahrenheit. That calf's going to burn its poor little mouth. It's going to back out of that feeder. It's not going to finish that milk meal, and it's probably going to be reluctant to come up and get its next milk meal until it's really, really hungry. So this is too hot, far too hot. And of equal concern, we've got a reading down here of 81 degrees Fahrenheit, which is far too cold. Cold milk to calves is a concern for a few reasons. First of all, in the wintertime, it's a heat sink. It actually sucks heat out of that calf's body to warm that milk when it drinks it. Secondly, we know that calves don't consume as much cold milk as they would normal warm milk, so it's going to maybe restrict intake. And the final point here is that if you're trying to mix powder into cold water, it doesn't mix very well. So that could contribute to variability in the total solids that we're seeing. So we're seeing a lot of things in this data that are a concern in terms of inconsistency. The flowability of the powder that you put in these machines is also going to matter in terms of the consistency of the total solids delivered to the calf. We want, obviously, the correct amount of powder to dump down and be mixed up with every single feeding to every single calf. If we run into powders that suck up humidity that want to stick up in the hopper and not fall down, then this is going to create problems because, let's say, the first calf doesn't get enough solids because the solids don't flow down the way they should. The next calf might get 1.5 doses of solids. And so again, this is going to contribute to variation in total solids and contribute to potentially to poor calf performance and poor calf health. Back to those high bacteria counts, here's some pictures from Tom Earlywine from Land O'Lakes visiting some farms, and you can imagine why some of those bacteria counts were as high as they were when you look at this milk dispensing hose. Obviously this hose wasn't cleaning. It should have been thrown away and replaced a long time ago. Looking at the picture of this nipple, apart from the milk film, apart from the fly, let's just ignore the fly for a minute. One of the biggest concerns I have with this nipple is the condition of the nipple. You can see it's split wide open. My concern with that is if this is mounted fairly high up so that the calf's head is raised as it's drinking from this nipple, it runs a high risk of aspirating milk into its lungs while it's trying to get its milk meal. And so creating aspiration pneumonia is an issue when we have nipples in this condition. And this is true of nipples on bottles in individually housed calves as well. You have to pay close attention to the nipple condition or you could run into problems. So to summarize this first study from Virginia Tech, the total solids and the temperature were highly variable. The average bacteria counts were far too high. They well exceeded the goal of 20,000 CFUs per mil total plate count. In general, Bob James noted that the biotic system appeared to be worse. It required greater attention and maintenance than the more sophisticated Forster Technique machines. And his final comment that he left with that study was that producers that purchased and installed these systems under the assumption that calves can be fed and left alone were not satisfied with how these systems performed. Now, more recently, Bob James in Virginia and ourselves here in Minnesota, we are collaborating currently on an observational study of 10 farms, 6 in Virginia, 4 here in Minnesota. They're all using Forster Technique equipment, and we're looking at a number of different outcomes, including health and detecting sick calves. I'm not going to talk about that today. But this is just, this slide is of some preliminary data describing the bacteria counts coming from these 10 farms. These are the average bacteria counts. I haven't got the range here. But if we say that our goal for the upper limit for bacteria counts for what's being dispensed from these systems should be 20,000 CFUs per mil, so that's down here somewhere, you can see most of these farms are exceeding that goal. We've got maybe 3 Minnesota dairies that are on average clean, that are less than 20,000 CFUs per mil on average, 1 Virginia dairy that's not doing too badly, and the remaining farms are too high, and these 3 are out of control. So I guess this demonstrates to me that these systems can clean if people are doing the job right, but you have to pay attention to them or they won't clean. And so these are some tips coming from Bob James on sanitation, maintenance, and calibration of this equipment. Producers need to pay a lot closer attention to these 3 items on these machines than they traditionally have done, at least in my personal experience and Bob's. So our goal would be that the total plate count should be less than 20,000 CFUs per mil, coliform count less than 10 CFUs per mil. And so if you were to collect milk from this dispensing hose, and have your veterinarian submit it to the local mastitis lab and culture it. This is what we're shooting for. In order to get there, Bob is currently recommending these steps. First of all, verify the temperature of the water that you're cleaning at and the type and the concentration of the sanitizing agents that are being used. This is frequently not what's being recommended. The water isn't hot enough, or they don't have the right agent, or it's not concentrated enough. The circuit cleaning needs to be done daily. They recommend swapping out and disinfecting the nipples daily. You don't throw them away, but you just swap them in and out so that they're frequently disinfected. The dispensing hose needs to be thrown away weekly and just replaced new because they don't clean as well as we hoped that they would. And finally, you need to monitor the condition of that nipple and replace them as needed. Now, if you're reluctant to do all that and you think your machine is working fine, that's great. But I guess what I would suggest then is do some monitoring. When your veterinarian's out, whether it's twice a week, every couple of weeks, or once a month, or whatever, have your veterinarian or have a consultant take some samples, take some measurements, and see what your machine is really doing. And if it's under control, great. But if it's not, consider adopting some of these points that Bob is recommending. Another point is to check the total solids frequently on what's being dispensed. Check the level and the consistency. How variable is it? And finally, have the distributor come and verify the calibration frequently. So one of the challenges, one of the take-home points from this work is that people need to pay very close attention to the cleaning and the calibration and the maintenance of these machines. Okay, moving away from the machine now, we're going to talk a little bit about managing the group and the calves. One of the first questions that comes up is, how old should the calf be when I introduce it to the group? And I didn't make this a polling question, but could have. But just in looking at farms here in Minnesota, I know people will introduce calves as young as 2 days of age and as old as 3 weeks of age. It's highly variable. Well, what does the research say? Well, we don't have a lot of research on this question, but so far all of the research is pointing to one answer, and that is that it's better if you wait and introduce that calf at an older age, preferably over 12 days of age before it's introduced to the pen. The first benefit of waiting until the calf is older is that they're a little bit smarter and they catch on a little bit quicker. I've got 3 different studies listed here that basically says if you can delay introducing the calf to 14 days of age versus younger, 6 days of age, it's just going to catch on a whole lot quicker. The second point, and this is really interesting to me as a veterinarian, is that it looks like there may be less disease in calves if you can delay until they're older, delay introduction to the group. There's a randomized clinical trial of 892 calves in 9 Swedish herds, and actually the trial was looking at evaluating group size effect on health, which we'll talk about later. But as an observation within the study, they noted that they had more 50% increased risk of respiratory disease if the calves were moved into the group at a young age, less than 12 days of age, versus delaying until they're over 12 days of age. So what is currently recommended is that you background those calves in individual pens for ideally 12 to 14 days, hand feed them, get through them in the high-risk scours period, make sure they're drinking well, and then you introduce them to the feeder. All right, the next question or point is, how do you train them to the feeder? And I have seen no studies on this. This is all just people's experience and anecdotes and testimonials as to what works well. Tom Erlewine, again with Land O'Lakes, or Bob James, they've recommended something like this. Maybe some of you have figured out alternate smart ways of doing this, but if they're being backgrounded in an individual pen, skip the morning feeding that morning in the individual pen so they're a little bit hungry, and then later in the morning put them in the auto feeder pen in the group pen and lead them to the nipple, and hopefully they'll be hungry and they'll catch on. General impressions are that 90% of calves will learn fairly quickly, probably in that first day or so. 90% are special needs children and need a little more help, more assisted trips. However, there is one caution. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to kill them with kindness, so to speak, where the calves can learn to associate your presence with their being able to go up and drink. And I actually have seen this in real life of a calf that refused to go drink unless the person was in the barn, and then the calf would stand up and go drink, which is obviously something that we want to avoid. So on average, it's suggested that the average pen will be trained in on 1.5 days, but there will be individual calves that need more help. Okay, the next point to talk about, and I think to me this is one of the most critical issues surrounding management of group house calves, is what will the group size be? And all of the data is pointing us to the answer that smaller groups is better. And by smaller, I mean much smaller, 8 to 10 calves or less. Now, for those of you who are working with these systems, at least here in the Midwest, distributors are frequently telling producers that they can put 25 and 30 calves on a station. However, I'm going to push back on that and say if you do that, you are going to see more problems. And most people get down to under 20 calves. And again, I'm going to show you some research in a minute here that will suggest that you really want it under 8 or 10 calves. The issues related to group size are, well, there are multiple issues, but the first is that with more crowding, more nose-to-nose contact, more contamination of that environment, more sharing of the nipple, we've just got that many more opportunities to transmit disease from sick calves to healthy calves. So increased disease rates becomes a bigger risk with larger groups. The other concern is that with bigger and bigger groups, you're going to create more and more competition at the feeder. Perhaps creating situations where calves are fighting, they're pushing each other around trying to get access to the feeder, and eventually you may be restricting intake. Some calves may not be able to get their full daily milk allowance if the group size is just too big. Here is some data from Denmark describing the effect of group size on calf behavior and their ability to access that feeder. What we have here is a randomized trial with calves allocated to either a small group or a large group. The small groups had 12 calves per group. The large group had 24 calves per group. And what we're seeing on the y-axis here is the minutes per calf per day that calf was able to go into the feeder. So if you were in a small group, you got upwards of 40 minutes per day in the feeder, and the vast majority of that time was undisturbed. There was nobody trying to butt you out of there, push you out of the way. However, if you were in the large group of 24 calves per group, you got significantly less time, just over 25 minutes per day, that you were able to access that milk. And at least half of that time, somebody was disturbing you. Somebody was behind you trying to get you out. So larger groups has the potential to create more agonistic behavior between calves, more stress, and potentially restricting milk intakes. And then as the veterinarian, I have to be really concerned about the disease risk that comes along with these larger group sizes. This is perhaps the strongest study we have demonstrating this effect. This is a Swedish study, randomized clinical trial, 9 herds, 892 calves, where calves are randomly allocated to either small groups of 6 to 9 calves per group or large groups of 12 to 18 calves per group. And in the large groups, they saw a 40% increased risk for respiratory disease and reduced rate of gain. And that makes sense. If you get sick, you don't grow. So this is the first best study saying we really need to have the smallest group possible, under 8 to 10 calves. We have one of our dairy pathologists here at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Jeremy Sheffers. He's a little bit dark, a little bit dry in his sense of humor, and he there's a couple of quotes I'll just share with you from Dr. Sheffers. The first one is that you will get under 20 calves per group one way or another. Chuckle, chuckle. And his second quote that I'll mention is that stocking density is self-correcting. All right, so my concern is that people that put calves in large groups, you're going to be having more disease, more sick calves, and potentially more dead calves. Here are 2 more studies saying exactly the same thing. The first is a different Swedish study, 122 herds, 3,000 calves. This is an observational study wherein they described the incidence of respiratory disease in calves housed in single pens, small groups, 3 to 6 calves per group, or large groups, 8 to 30 calves per group. And you can see the incidence of respiratory disease doubles in the large group situations. Finally, some U.S. Data. This is from USDA study, the last USDA study, 1,600 herds, 47,000 calves, where they noted that the mortality risk was upwards of 50% greater when calves are housed in large groups. And large is not big. 7 calves or more. All right. So I'm going to really strongly encourage people to keep their group sizes as small as possible if they are using group housing systems. The dynamics of pen management is another important point that's going to impact on calf behavior and potentially calf health. Ideally, we have an all-in, all-out situation where you fill the pen in one day, and then you empty that pen in one day, and then you can clean it down, clean it out, wash, and sanitize. But we all know that this is really hard to do on all but the very largest of dairies. On most small and medium-sized dairies, there's going to be staggered entry and perhaps staggered exit of calves from these pens. You may have 30-day-old calves. We've got a picture of a bigger calf here with a smaller calf. There may be a 2-day, 3-day, 5-day-old calf in the same pen with a 30-day-old calf. And I have two concerns with that situation. The first is that the smaller calf may have a harder time competing, getting access to the feeder if there's a bigger calf there, and obviously that will be compounded with bigger group sizes. The second concern that I have is that if disease is introduced in this pen, it can easily become endemic. The older calves will always pass that disease down to the younger calves. You will never break the disease cycle. And that will be true of enteric disease, scours, pneumonia, salmonella, mycoplasma. It doesn't matter, the bug. If you have a continuous flow system, it's very easy to set up a situation where the disease is now endemic in that pen and you can never break that cycle. So pen dynamics, how you manage the calves coming in and out of the pen, will be important. The pen environment in terms of air quality and bedding management is also important. Of course, this is true of any calf housing system, whether it's individual or group housing. This is always important. I'm not going to say anything about ventilation. That's a huge topic in and of itself. If you're concerned about ventilation, have your veterinarian or consultant come out and evaluate your ventilation. They can give you some tips on improving it if that's what's required. In terms of bedding management, the same principles apply to all housing systems. It must be clean, it must be dry, it must be comfortable. In winter, in colder environments where the calves are cold stressed, the gold standard is deep bedded straw, so that those calves can nestle down into the bedding, and it can provide some kind of insulation value to keep them a little bit warmer. The last point I'll make about bedding is that I personally I'm not a fan of slatted floors or tenderfoot slats for calves. There are 3 strikes against these types of systems. First of all, with no bedding, there's a chilling effect on these calves lying on slats with cold air coming up from underneath. Second of all, frankly, they're uncomfortable, and we've got studies documenting reduced lying time in calves that are housed on slats versus in a deep bedded system like this picture I've got here to the right. And finally, I'm absolutely convinced that we have more joint injuries, more beaten up, swollen joints, lame calves when they're housed on slats rather than a deep bedding system. And I've frankly seen too many calves ruined with beat up joints using those types of systems. So I would encourage people to use deep bedded or some kind of a comfortable bedding system and not have calves on slats. Okay. Next point, next thing we're going to talk about is the milk allowance. What should the milk allowance be per day? What should the milk allowance be per meal? So if you've got a computer feeder and you want to program in how many quarts per meal a calf can have, the question is, do you give them small frequent meals or do you give them larger meals if they choose? And the answer is you want to give them larger meals if they choose. This is a study that offered calves on the left side 4 large meals, or on the right side 8 small meals per day. Both groups of calves got the same total volume per day. And what we see on the right hand side is if you're allowed small frequent meals, we actually see more frustrated calves there. They're in the feeder more minutes per day looking for food. They're hungry, but in the red here, most of that time is unrewarded. They're just frustrated calves. So there's going to be more hungry calves and more agonistic behavior, calves struggling to get in like we see in this picture here. So what we want to do is offer large meals, let the calf fill up 2, 2.5, even 3 quarts per feeding. Let it fill up, it's full, it's satisfied, it can go lay down and rest and grow, which is what we want to see. The other problem with small frequent meals, especially if the calf's hungry, is we're going to see more of this cross-sucking behavior, which is going to be, again, a great opportunity to transmit disease. So recommended milk allowance per day would be 2 to 2.5 gallons per day or more. Per meal, 2 to 2.5 liters or quarts per meal. This is just an example of a feeding program. This is not necessarily a good or bad example of a feeding program, but this is one provided by Land O'Lakes. In this example, the calf has been backgrounded already for 12 days, so it's on day 13 that it's introduced to the pen. We'll just look at the black line. This is liters of milk per day the calf is allowed. So they ramp up to 7 liters per day. They hold it there for 4 more weeks, so now the calf is 6 weeks old. They decide they want to wean it at the end of 7 weeks, and so what they do is they step down about 50%. They hold it there for 1 more week, and then they wean at 7 weeks. The alternative is you could slowly taper down and wean at the 7th week. But the point with this slide is that you can basically program whatever you want. I personally don't, I think they should get more. I think we should wean them later, but that's up to you. All right, you can feed pasteurized waste milk through auto feeders. We have producers here in Minnesota doing this. Just be aware that there's more infrastructure required. You have to pasteurize the milk, hold it, chill it, then transfer that to the feeder, warm it, feed it. And so that's just more equipment that you need to move milk through and that you need to make sure is properly cleaned and sanitized. So it can be done, just more infrastructure to pay attention to and monitor and clean. Okay, we're getting near the end here. This is a picture of an auto grain feeder. The bottom line is don't invest your money in these. They actually deter calves. It's a scary place to go. It makes a loud noise, and calves actually come on to starter grain more slowly if they are forced to come into these systems. So what's recommended is, in terms of getting them on starter grain, put it out free choice in a trough or in a fence line feeder for the whole group, and the group will come on to grain more quickly. All right, last important point I want to talk about is how do we find a sick calf when it's in a group? Now, as I mentioned before, with the sophisticated computer feeders, they will report on a computer screen in your office or on a handheld unit at the machine. They will report per day the total consumption of milk, so liters per day of milk consumed, the drinking speed, the average drinking speed for the last day, and the visits to the feeder. And what it will do is it will flag calves based on big changes in the last 24 hours as compared to the previous 72 hours. So in this picture here, we've got 2 calves flagged in red that went down in their milk consumption sometime over the last 24 hours. So in theory, this system will help you to find a sick calf, or at least identify a calf of concern that you can go and take a look at. Now, how well does this system work really in finding a sick calf? I'm going to present some data that would suggest it doesn't always work as well as you might hope. This is some data from the University of British Columbia. We've got 2 groups of calves here. One group is fed 4 liters per day of milk. That's restricted intake in my opinion. The other is fed 8 liters a day of milk. And within each of these 2 groups, we've got 2 lines, which is 2 groups of calves. The first line is calves that stayed healthy. The second is the milk intake, liters per day, in the calves that got sick. Okay, and day 0 is the day the calf got sick. So, final point is, what is this little red triangle? The red triangle is the day that the person with the eyeball actually saw the sick calf. So let's look first of all at the 8 liter per day group. The day that the sick calves got sick and would have been flagged in red by the machine, the person saw that calf at the same time. So the machine did not find that calf any more quickly than the person with a good set of eyeballs. All right, now looking at the second group of calves here, and this is more interesting even, the 4 liter per day calves that got sick, it didn't matter that they were sick. They were still so hungry that they stayed on milk. So the computer feeder did not flag the sick calves in this group. The person flagged the sick calves in this group. So the take-home point from this is that the computer may not be timely or sensitive as compared to a human observer. So you still need a good person looking at those calves, finding sick calves for you. Yes, you can use the computer, but don't rely solely on the computer. It will miss calves. All right, so just to summarize then, let's wrap this up. Auto feeders and group housing systems, they can add flexibility to labor. They can be an efficient tool for delivering good nutrition program to the calf, but they are not the answer to poor calf management. All of your other ducks have to be in a row, so to speak, and we'll go over that in a minute. They will not be the answer for calves who for people who don't want to spend time managing calves. And you can see significant increases in disease rates in calves in these systems. So just to summarize the challenges, here they are. Disease control is going to be a challenge. The potential to create competition for feed and space, especially with large group sizes. Detecting sick calves is going to be a little more challenging, and you must pay attention to the cleaning, the maintenance, and calibration of that machine and monitoring how well it's doing. So the last two slides here I have are a summary of best management practices for group house calves. The first 6 points I have on this slide aren't actually specific or unique to group house calves. These apply to all calf housing systems. So you want excellent colostrum management, ventilation, bedding management. You don't want to restrict milk intake. You want free choice access to clean water and high quality starter pellet. And you want careful, frequent observation of calves to find illness early. These points apply to any calf housing system. The second list of points that I have here are specific to group housing. You want to delay introduction for 12 to 14 days. You want the smallest group size possible, ideally less than 8 to 10 calves. You want to pay careful attention to the sanitation, maintenance, and calibration of that feeding equipment and monitor that. You want good space per calf, at least 40 square foot per calf, don't overcrowd. And finally, as much as possible, manage as an all-in, all-out system, or keep the range of ages in that pen as narrow as possible. All right, my last point is regardless of whatever feeding or housing system you are using, there are big advantages to feeding more milk. So I encourage you to do that. Your challenge is to find the best system that's going to work for you if you're thinking about a new system, or how to best manage the system that you already have in place. And hopefully what we've talked about today will give you some ideas on how to achieve that. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for attending today, and I'm going to hand this back over to Mike, who I believe is going to field some questions if there are any. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Sandra. I'll turn it back to Steve. Steve, do you want to give the benediction?
I will. Thank you very much, Sandra, for a great presentation. Very practical. I think you've brought up a lot of very interesting management points here, at least some that I wouldn't have thought of, and so I think you've really done a great service to our listeners out there. We want to call our listeners' attention to our next webinars, July 13th. Ken Nordland will be talking about the transition cows and what they want us to provide for them. Beringer Ingelheim is going to be the sponsor of that time. Looking ahead to August 10, Rick Grant from the Minor Institute is going to be back with us, sponsored by DuPont Pioneer. He's going to be talking about milking ration fiber levels and what we've learned recently in research and observation about fiber. This is a chance for me to also remind our listeners that they'll be receiving a brief survey here in a couple of days, and we appreciate your responses to those surveys to help us stay on track with our planning of future webinars. Also, all of this webinar, of course, and all of our previous ones are available archived free for your use at any time. Just go to hordes.com and click on the webinar section of our webpage. Again, our thanks to Sandra and to Mike Hutchins, our co-host down there at University of Illinois, with Jim Baltz down there as well. And Mike, with those comments, I will see if there are any questions that you can moderate.
Yes, Sandra, we have two quick questions here for you. The first one was brought up and saying, what about putting more nipples into a pen if, in fact, you have to stay with a larger number of calves?
Yes, I have been to farms. I've seen systems where people have put multiple nipples into a pen, so that that is certainly doable. That may solve the problem, or help to solve the problem of the time budget and running out of enough minutes in the day for every calf to get up and get its milk meal. So that'll address that problem. You'll still, if you have a very large group size, you still have the other challenges of stocking density and overcrowding and disease transmission, but at least having the multiple nipples in the pens will address the challenge of making sure that every calf can at least get access to its milk allowance for the day.
The second question is, is there anything you could put in the milk replacer to keep the bacteria counts down? Some type of inhibitor. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there are acidified milk replacers, but they're really those are meant to mix up and leave out acidified to delay bacterial growth. Um, I have not seen anything that you put in the milk that is designed to sanitize the milk as it's flowing through that hose. Where that contamination is coming from, it's not from the water probably, and it's not from the powder probably. It's from bacterial contamination in an improperly cleaned mixer and dispensing hoses. And so no, I have not seen anything yet, at least, that is going to be in the milk that is going to, on contact, kill or neutralize the bacteria that it picks up flowing through a contaminated or a dirty hose.
Okay, next question. If you had a herd of 1,000 cows, what type of calf rearing facility would you put in?
Personally, the gold standard, my gold standard for calves are hutches. Recognizing that, yes, it's miserable in the middle of January in Minnesota to feed calves in a snowstorm, but from the calf's point of view, hutches are the gold standard. Now, if we want to make a compromise, if I'm asking somebody to go and feed calves in the middle of rain or snow, I think probably what I would do, though, is go to a naturally ventilated barn, curtain barn, for example, with individually penned calves within a barn. So that way you've got a roof over the head of the person, you've got light to work by, but you still have a calf that's housed in an individual pen, and therefore you are hopefully preventing a lot of the disease transmission risk that is of concern with the group housing situation. So my preference would be to pick one of the systems that offers individual housing to those calves.
Okay, well, I think that completes the questions for today. Steve, any other final comments you want to bring forth? Maybe not, Steve. Anyway, I think we're done at this point.
We still have a number of people with us, and we thank them for staying with us. Again, Sandra, thanks to you for a very interesting presentation. And
my pleasure. And if I can just make one more comment, if anybody has questions and they want to email me later with questions or comments or anything like that, please feel free.
Very good. We appreciate your offer to do that. And as always, thanks, Mike and Jim down there. With that, we'll bow out.
Have a good one.
Thanks again, everybody. Yes, thanks again.